Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and this is just a brief response to the Wagner debate, why Christian Wagner is wrong about the Filioque. Now, I appreciated the debate. I appreciated that. I think as far as, I think, it was a strong showing from Wagner. It's just like Urhan clearly won the debate. I'll get to that more in a moment. But I did appreciate in the debate an exchange that happened on the Acts of Florence. Now, Urhan made the statement that the acts of the council are not binding, while Wagner defended the decrees are contextualized by what's in the acts. And obviously, this is correct because you have to understand the decree of the council according to how the people writing the decree understood how the decree is supposed to be interpreted. So I think Wagner is fundamentally correct in that is how one is to interpret the conciliar acts. Urhan was correct in saying in the way that they quote something will determine whether it has import upon the decree or not. Obviously, like the letter of Maris, for example, would not be an example of something that is binding because it's in the council. In fact, it's quoted to be rejected in Chalcedon. That aside, it's been that Florence fails to meet the criteria of pentarchic reception. It's ultimately an irrelevant point, like whether or not Florence is interpreted according to his acts or not is good history, but it is not necessarily really relevant to the Orthodox Christian because it doesn't meet the canonical standards for a ecumenical council as dictated by Session 6 of Nicaea II, that you need all of the pentarchy to receive the council and the whole Christian world, really. Now, that being said, Urhan won the debate. Now, I think Wagner and some Roman Catholics try to make much of Urhan being thrown on the ropes a little bit during the second cross exam. And this to me proves the point that you never fight the underdog like Apollo Creed did in the first Rocky movie, because all the underdog has to do is not get killed in the ring and they won. And essentially, that's what happened here. Yeah, he had a few good punches there, but I think to anyone informed, in all honesty, Urhan clearly won this debate. I also think that by kind of leaving the realm of historical theology and then getting to the whole argument over inferences and theological and philosophical speculation, that helps the person that doesn't have historical case. So that makes Milton Thomas fight above his weight class, per se. And I think it made Urhan, who was trying to trap Milton Thomas into saying something overtly heretical and self-contradictory, that people saw the fact that Wagner didn't get automatically steamrolled, that he won. And just the reality is, it's just that, yeah, two people arguing over inferences, person with the finder sounding inferences may come out on top. And ultimately speaking, it's not even the person who is correct. So I'm not a big fan of that. I'm more of a fan of historical theology. From what I could tell, Wagner was making distinctions from quote mines and secondary sources and drawing inferences from these sources, but he's never read them. And this is something I've seen, and if he's read them, by the way, apparently not very carefully, but judging from the citations from the PG, he's not opening the PG or going to Google and getting the PG in front of him and reading these documents in their entirety in Greek. That's just not believable. Scholars don't even do stuff like that. So this to me shows that he's just getting from quote mines. And Duong was very similar. And when I had my Filioque response video, the Duong, I was showing that you could go to the next paragraph, the previous sentence, the subsequent sentence, and you could see this guy's drawing inferences they'd be disproven if you just read the next sentence. And so why are people debating stuff they haven't read, just stuff they've seen in quote mines, is highly questionable. And this shows why they have to make their whole debate based upon inferences and just, syllogisms and not actually historical theology. Now, that being said, I do think the most outrageous aspect of this debate was this historical point, which Wagner most likely got wrong. And this is obviously Basil's Against Eunomius. Wagner cited this interpolated forged version, most likely again. It's we're not God and we can't go back in time to know for a fact what happened. But he cites it as one of the linchpins of his argument. And even though it's rejected by Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic scholars alike, now his argument essentially is there were allegedly more copies of the interpolated text according to Eunomius, and for some reason that matters more than Mark of Ephesus saying, no, there's way more copies of his version of Against Eunomius. And you just hear, well, they took their version Against Eunomius with them. By the way, all these other people became Uniates, so they were swimming in highly questionable waters before going to the council to begin with, a lot of these guys. But that being said, that because a lot of their copies had the wrong stuff, that must mean the wrong stuff was the right stuff. Now, this is not a totally crazy argument. In fact, it's an argument that would have made a lot of sense in the 15th century, and they had, let's say, the sort of information that's come up in other research like Alexakis. Now, that's where I think John Colarafi won the internet by kind of saying, well, hasn't anyone read Alexakis on this point? Now, Alexakis is someone I've read years ago on this point, and I kind of forgot a lot about it until John Colarafi brought it back up and to the conversation as well as to me privately. And here are my views. I'm not totally convinced of Alexakis' arguments. I'm aware that the best scholarship has to offer right now. Alexakis' argument could be distilled as this. He argues that Maximus mentions the existence of Florentium in the letter of Marinus. We have a Florentium, and that's the 7th century. In the 8th century, in the late 8th century, we have an extant Florentium that matches the things that are described by Maximus in the letter of Marinus. But that Florentium lacks the passages from Against Eunomius ascribed to Basil. Now, in the 13th century, someone quotes or translates or compiles this 8th century Florentium, but includes the Against Eunomius passages. From this, Alexakis works backwards. If it existed in the 13th century, then it exists in the 8th century. And if it existed in the 8th century, then it existed in the 7th century. And that's the argument. It's a possible argument, but you can see distilled, it's not self-evident. It's certainly not a self-evident argument. My opinion is that if it wasn't there in the 8th century, and we don't see Basil cited in the letter of Marinus, then it was in the 9th century or 10th century or whenever, sometime afterwards. I favor 9th century because Alexakis points out you have needed people learned in Greek to come up with this. And so if they were learning Greek, he identifies the monks surrounding St. Maximus. Now, St. Maximus is far too smart. Anyone who's read the Florentia in Lateran 649, even if you presume the worst, that Maximus was doctoring a few Dio-Energus and Diothelite passages, they were at least cogent. The passage ascribed to Basil and Against Eunomius, these interpolations, aren't cogent. There's no way Maximus would have doctored it this way. We are aware of this Florentium, or at least letter of Marinus, coming back up again in the conversation. It was in the 9th century, in fact, by Anastasius the librarian. Now, I don't know for a fact that he added anything to Florentia. This is something other scholarship have to do. But if it's after the late 8th century that this found its way in, well, at least we knew there were people in Rome in the late 9th century that were learned in reading Greek text and doctoring Greek text. And so this may be a better point of time to look at, because not only was the Florentium altered, full texts of Against Eunomius were altered. And we do know that in the late 9th century, full texts of even councils like Nicaea II were altered by the papal chancery. And this is something in my research when it comes to the Nicaea II will bring out in further detail when my book, Rise, Fall, Catholics of the Papacy comes out. So that being said, there was also a debate over the Filioque between Pope Nicholas and Photius. So this, just like in the papacy of Theodore and Maximus, had a motivation to try to defend the Western confession of Filioque against charges of heresy. The same existed in the 9th century. And so all I'm saying is, because I don't want to make everything about Anastasius, is really not my point. There is good textual grounds to look in the 9th century on this question. Alexakis doesn't do this, but to be fair to Alexakis, a lot of stuff about Anastasius wasn't even written for another 10 years and even 20 years after he wrote his thesis. So now maybe that's time for someone else to kind of dig into this a little deeper and look into maybe potentially 9th century forgeries of Against Eunomius. Now, there's one other point I like to make, and it came up in passing in one of the cross exams, and that's this. In reference to 9th century popes asserting unilateral power to alter the creed, Wagner says, well, this existed in the late 9th century popes, like when the popes are after John VIII. So this must mean that popes understood they could unilaterally change the creed. Now, simply pointing out this exists in the late 9th century doesn't prove this is an earlier papal view. In fact, to quote a pope of the previous century, Pope Leo III, he says that the Filioque, may be sung in teaching and be taught by being sung, but neither by writing nor by singing may it be unlawfully inserted into that which it is forbidden us to touch, meaning it can't be inserted into the creed, it's forbidden. So what changed between the papacy of the late 8th century and the papacy of the late 9th century? Well, as I will detail in my book, Rise and Fall of the Papacy, what changed was Anastasius the Librarian. While I can only speculate in a non-serious way about perhaps there's a hand against Eunomius, I have absolute confidence, and the book will painstakingly prove that Anastasius most definitely expounded papal forgeries, the pseudo-Nestorian decretals, internationally, when beforehand they only were being used in France. He created forgeries in the letter to Pope Adrian to Constantinople IV and the minutes of Nicaea II, and he changed the canonical understanding of Trullo, as well as invented papal infallibility in a letter to John the Deacon. And so we see Anastasius invents these crazy new ideas, and the papacies after Anastasius adhere to these crazy ideas invented by Anastasius. But they didn't exist in the 8th century. They exist after Anastasius. And so, interestingly, I think this kind of makes a point that even my book doesn't make it, which is that there is a role that Anastasius plays in this Filioque controversy. The epistemic role, which is what is the role of papacy doctrinally? It has certainly changed between the 8th and 9th centuries. And there's just no rational explanation how Pope Leo III could say one thing without just saying, oh, well, he's fallible, which is kind of irrelevant. Pope Leo III said what people normally believed, and then that just changes 100 years later. Why is that? My book gets into that. So I'm going to do some question and comments. That is my my banter on what happened during the debate. I will make the following comments on Christian Wagner. I'm just not a fan of his apologetics. I don't mean to say this because I want to offend him. I really honestly don't. I think my tone here shows I'm not trying to do that, but he's just really not a solid apologist, in my opinion. Quoting a forgery, or at best, a disputed text as a linchpin in a debate is just not good debating. Flip-flopping on, without apology, on whether Thomas Aquinas thought what he was quoting were forgeries or not, and against Greek errors, is just not quality apologetics. Claiming that you are a Newman scholar as a way of diverting from the fact that Newman said questionable things and you disagree with my interpretation of something that Newman said, yes, doesn't mean I'm right. It just means that he lied about being a Newman scholar because actual scholarship has the same read in Newman that I have. And so just to me, it's just sort of these kind of outrageous flippant things where it's just kind of hard to take him seriously. Now, I've heard, this is private stuff, and I won't get into details, that he's actually a nice guy in person. And so maybe he's just a bad apologist, but a stand-up fella in the real world. God bless him. I can't comment on that. In fact, I would hope and I trust that he actually is a decent fellow. But I do think that the apologetics gets the best of him. He makes bad arguments. He seems just to get angry and try to say like these witticisms to kind of divert from the fact he's just not making good points. And this is why there would never, ever be a debate between me and him, because the reality is I couldn't have a debate without pointing out when he's just making outrageous statements. And I prefer to debate someone who, if I disagree with them, at least they have some sort of sense to what they're saying. They're being honest. They're not lying about being scholars. They apologize when they screw something up. I will point out when I have a wrong interpretation or I read something or I said something wrong, because I'm not God and I make mistakes. But other people, perhaps because they're younger, they haven't learned to be gracious with their mistakes. So that's my comments on that. And just word to the wise to, be very mindful and to check his stuff, because he's not going to correct the record for you. You would have to look into that yourself. So that being said, we'll have some questions. I'm going to do some quick plugs before comments and questions. If this has blessed you, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. It's a new month. We need new donors for the church in Cambodia. Please donate below. And that'd be very much appreciated. It's down there at the link. Please, we need donors at least once a month. Give $5, give whatever. Help support evangelism in Cambodia. Please pray for John. We're trying to start a Cambodian YouTube channel there. Also, my wife will be shooting a few videos hopefully soon. Pray that God will give us time so that she can start doing some Khmer apologetics for the Khmer people. Those are the Cambodian people. So again, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Your prayers are appreciated. And if, there's other great things like, Holy Trinity Monastery, other great ministries, support those. If this has blessed you, bless someone else, and God will bless you. All right, so time for questions and comments. We have Wagner pose if he won. And yeah, it's kind of like the Ron Paul thing where like he won 5th in the straw poll in Iowa, and they try to get all excited about it or whatever. And it's to compensate for not winning, in my opinion. Most people always think they win. I'm one of those people where I'll say, I won this debate, I lost that debate, but most people have to win all the time. Let's see, we got this. Personally, I thought David was the underdog. Wagner seems to be the more experienced debater. I think Burhan's been on the scene longer than him, but all right, that's your opinion. And Glenn is entitled to his opinion, that's for sure. The Florentine Filioque is a innovation. And again, this is an Orthodox channel, so of course we believe such things. We have Zhuang says Letter Marinus is disputed. Yeah, it was disputed during Florence, but it's really not seriously disputed today. And it finds itself, like I said, quoted by Anastasius the librarian, it has early, it's already existence in the first millennium. There's really no real good reason to think it's not real. So that's that. I will say, though, it's because it was probably written in Rome, it didn't find itself in, I think, the full compendium of Maximus letters. And that's not normal. It's not impossible, but it's not normal. So for someone in the 15th century to dispute the Letter Marinus, they weren't being disingenuous. That would have been a normal way of interpreting matters at that time. Now, we got the peace sign, and that's right, we want peace. We could disagree. We could even not be fans of people's apologetics, but we could keep cool. And I think let's keep the peace. We have this. I get David's arguments, but I really do worry about how much he looked like he didn't have a good breadth of knowledge. All right, well, that is this argument about David. See, David was being internally consistent and sounded like he read some of these things, and the other sounded like kind of quote mining to me. That's how it came across to me. I just have that. I just have what's published. We have Christian Wagner is a Chad. There you go. We got a chat here. We have a blasphemous hashtag, which I will not read. Watchman Prime says, let's see, the book should be out soon, like in a month or so. Yes, November. It's looking like late November or early December. Rise and Fall of the Papacy. It will be out. It's in its final drafts where the final typesetting stuff is being fixed, and then it's got to get printed. So pray this will be out sooner rather than later, and there's other irons in the fire as well, but the book should be out soon. That's right. So let's see. We have Trenton Naylor. Did you go over what he said about the Filioque being one of these interpolations? I'm not sure what text this is referring to, and I put that below. Let's see. Can you explain why he used the local council say you can add to the creed, and how do you answer Catholics who say we also added to it? I think this must be a fine point from the cross-exam that maybe I'm not remembering. But in short, it's adding to the creed with the agreement of the church is not an issue, right? They amended the creed in Constantinople. They canonized both creeds in Chalcedon. Chalcedon made its own creed. That's not an issue. The consensus of the church, they can make doctrinal formulations. The councils reject anyone altering these formulations without the council's consent, because that's why even Mark of Ephesus and the Orthodox delegation was willing in Florence to include the Filioque as long as they accepted the letter of Marinus as the interpretation of the Filioque, which they rejected 3 times. And so that would be my response. It's like, for example, there's fine points of the Constantinopolitan Creed that are changed, just like I believe versus we believe, and it's stuff like that. So that's not a huge deal. The huge deal is to do it without the consent of the whole church. That is the real problem. So we have this. Do you think Scotus' position could be harmonized St. Palamas and St. Mark's Father Cops does? I will leave this to guys like David Erhan that are more philosophically strong in such points. I'm going to guess not, because he's outside the church. But I cannot give a strong theological defense or argument against this. Again, I just try to stick with historical theology because that's all I'm decent at. I wouldn't consider myself otherwise very good on an issue such as that. We could hope so, but hopes don't make things true. We have to deal with facts, not hopes. Not when it comes to doctrinal differences. Now we have this. I don't see how the CE text is heretical on the grounds of Eunomius of subordination without reading to the text semi-Sabellian claims, because the quote is about how the Father explains stuff like John 14:28. And again, the question is how it was interpreted during Florence. If you want to take the quote and reinterpret it as Aquinas did, I guess that's fine. That's a fine interpretation. But that's not how Wagner or Montanaro approached the same text. So there you go. We have this from Glenn Newman. Might have been, I'm not going to get this video taken down. So there you go. We have that. I don't know. I would prefer not speculating stuff without real evidence. How do you respond to the issue 4 out of 5 manuscripts of the council having the disputed Basil quote and what sounds like Cope from Basil about there being others without it at home? I think the other Paul, speaking of Mark, I would agree that during the council, them having more made it very reasonable at the council to presume that the side with more manuscripts had a better case, right? So that's it's not like they're being unreasonable. The response would be, when is our earliest attestation of this? And it's after the 9th century, because it's not in the 8th century. It's not in the 7th century. So we already know we're going past the point of when the Filioque was a debate where this quotation exists. And so that's the real issue. Also, the passage itself just doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem cogent. It seems too easy to be misinterpreted. But again, I am more relying upon the fact that we have scholars like Alexakis that would say that there's two different passages, and this one only finds itself an expression in Italy, in these Italian Floregia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did it find itself back east is a good question, and simply because there wasn't automatic schism until the 11th century, right? And so they would have been trading manuscripts and stuff, and so it entered circulation. As for the actual proportion, that's all a guesstimate because they were both disagreeing with one another. But the law of averages is like what, 20%, that 4 out of 5 could have turned out that way. So it's just not impossible. But like I said, that's why they weren't ridiculous during Florence to come to the judgment that they made. But is it self-evident from that alone? Absolutely not, especially because we don't have attestation before the 8th century of anything about this thing, and it wasn't in the 8th century text to begin with. So that's something to think about anyway. But yeah, I don't think it's ridiculous to entertain us with less evidence like they had. They didn't have a lot of evidence in the 15th century. Now we say this, even Dr. Branson says the term subordinationist is a modern term which would implicate some of the fathers on the monarchia. And I think this is like how sometimes people will try to slander St. Justin Martyr and stuff. But again, the question is third in order and dignity and how we are to interpret this. And that is the question. And we know how Florence interprets it. Now, going down the line, we have lots of dead air, bug, not a feature. Christian Wagner addresses Capps on his latest stream. I haven't watched it. I watched the debate. But again, as I point out here, we see how Aquinas addresses it. We see how Aquinas addresses it in 2 different chapters against Greek errors. And I honestly, I'm not very interested in following up however it's addressed, because Wagner flip-flops and just says things that aren't true, and he doesn't clarify matters. So to me, it's not entirely relevant, honestly. So anyway, what's this? Please pray for the mission endeavors on the side of the Ring of Fire. Roll corresponding open missions in the rural PNW. I don't know what PNW is. Well, I pray for all missionaries every day. So let's see. Supposedly, Bishop Enoch found another possible interpolation into De Trinitate. I'd be curious as to what, because I think De Trinitate doesn't really read in any heretical sense when read properly and consistently. I'm not making mental gymnastic interpretations. I just had 2 articles on this on orthodoxtheology.com/donate. I really challenge people to, without calling names, deal with the actual evidence and make the argument that Augustine is teaching double procession. So I just don't see it De Trinitate. Why did fathers like Clement of Rome or Augustine say Rome has spoken, the matter is resolved? Well, Clement of Rome never said that. And, Augustine or other issues as well. In the Western Patriarchate, in the Roman Patriarchate, Rome did have the final say. They were the patriarch. So if a matter is appealed, you can't go above the Supreme Court, all right? And so once it gets to the Supreme Court, then it's settled. The only court, according to Augustine, above the Pope of Rome and his synod is the Ecumenical Council. And so the context of Augustine's statement would change if the issue is whether Rome could be appealed, because Rome could be appealed according to letter 43 in the Ecumenical Council. All right, so we have that. Trenton says, so was Wagner right about God of God incarnate, the Holy Spirit, and the Virgin Mary interpolation? He said this towards the end of the last cross-examination. Again, he's talking about whether or not they are adding that Constantinople added to the creed. And there's some scholarly debate as to what the finalized creed of Constantinople was, because we even see in the minutes of Ephesus, for example, a slight variation of the Constantinopolitan creed. And so I wouldn't say the interpolations. I'd say perhaps there's just like the scriptures. There's slight variations in textual transmission, and at some point, there's one particular text type that gains ascendancy, and that's what gains the ascendant. I don't think God is very concerned to little jots and tittles. He's concerned if there is a point of difference that actually now changes what something doctrinally means, right? That is the real issue. All right, so Pacific Northwest was PNW. There you go. Pacific Northwest. See my comment and my hashtag. Don't want to leave you thinking I was using the Lord's name. Okay. And so that being said, hey, that's it. That's it for tonight. So I will end this show by quoting Jesus Rock, fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you guys. God bless Christian Wagner. Have a great day.